In this module, we're going to learn the difference between moderating variables and mediating variables. Moderating and mediating variables are variables that affect the relationship between two other variables in some way. In that sense, they would both be considered third variables. You can gauge your progress through the module by checking the slide status indicator on the upper right of the screen. In this module, we're going to first talk about moderators, and then we're going to talk about interaction effects. Once we discuss moderators, we'll introduce mediators, and we'll talk about the necessary conditions for mediators, as well as a strategy for statistically exploring mediation. Lastly, we'll discuss why it is important to understand moderating and mediating variables, and the practical implications for policy and treatment. So let's start with variables that moderate the relationship between two other variables. A moderating variable is a variable that affects the strength or regulates the relationship between two other variables. Now, depending on our analytical framework, we might call one of the other variables a predictor variable or independent variable. The other variable might be called the criterion variable, dependent variable, or outcome variable. Now, regardless of how the other two variables are labeled, the strength of their relationship is moderated or regulated by a third variable. Here's another way to look at it. Although we may know that a predictor has a relationship with an outcome variable, so does the moderator. In fact, the presence of the moderator may strengthen the relationship between the predictor. For example, it shouldn't surprise anyone that people who have worked a long time earn a higher salary than recent college graduates or new hires. Thus, there is a relationship between years at a company, for example, and salary. However, a common finding is that the number of years worked at a company isn't the only variable determining salary. One's gender moderates the relationship. In many companies, for example, we might find that males who have been with the company for a long time have a higher average salary than females who have been with the company for the same amount of time. This is an interaction effect. The relationship between years with the company and salary is moderated by one's gender. There may be other moderators as well, and we would need to test for those too. We see moderating variables in clinical contexts as well. In 2011, Pinellas and colleagues studied survivors of violent crime. Researchers measured their heart rate as the survivors talked about what happened to them. Individuals who showed the greatest increase in heart rate during their monologue were classified as having high trauma reactivity. Participants also completed a coping strategies inventory that measured the degree to which an individual primarily used an avoidant coping style. 3 months later, all survivors were interviewed by a clinician to assess levels of post-traumatic stress symptoms. What Pinellas and colleagues found was that those individuals with the strongest trauma reactivity after a crime, for example, increased heart rate during their monologue, had greater PTSD symptoms 3 months later, but only if they used avoidant coping as a primary coping style. In other words, an avoidant coping style moderated the relationship between traumatic reactivity and PTSD symptoms 3 months later. In contrast, a mediating variable is one that explains the relationship between two variables. It does not modulate or regulate the relationship. It makes the relationship possible to begin with. Mediating variables are often, but not always, intrinsic to or part of the organism. So you can think of a mediator kind of like a clasp. If you were trying to link two chains together, the clasp would be necessary to secure the linkage. Without the clasp, the link would not occur. So here's a good example. Many factors account for language expression. Everyday speech is in response to environmental stimulation or cues and can occur only once an individual has learned words, grammar, and syntax. Even something as simple as recognizing a face and saying the word face requires mediation by the brain. Expressive language is mediated by certain brain regions in the left hemisphere of the brain, like Wernicke's area and Broca's area. When those areas are damaged by a stroke or an accident, language is either impaired or lost completely. Thus, those areas of the brain mediate language expression. In clinical research, mediating variables are important to account for. For example, bipolar disorder is a serious mental health disorder that involves extreme highs and lows in mood. Milkowitz and Scott in 2009 conducted a meta-analysis of many studies and found across studies that some treatments, like cognitive behavior therapy, were reliably associated with reduced rates of relapse. However, other variables mediated treatment outcome and the probability of relapse. One of those was medication adherence. Without medication adherence, the likelihood of therapy preventing relapse was slim. However, medication adherence by itself was not sufficient to prevent relapse. Thus, the authors concluded that medication adherence mediated the relationship between therapy and relapse prevention. It is important to note that most analyses of mediation and moderation are based on quasi-experimental or correlational research designs. As such, knowing that a variable moderates or mediates a relationship is not the same as saying there is a causal relationship. Only controlled experimental studies can speak to causal relationships. Most clinical research does not have that kind of control. Now, that being said, correlation is a requisite feature of causation. While they are not the same, as cartoonist Randall Munroe once said, correlation does not imply causation, but it does waggle its eyebrows suggestively and gesture furtively while mouthing, "Look over here." According to Barron and Kinney, 1986, three conditions are necessary for mediation of two variables to occur. First, an independent variable must be related to the mediating variable and account for significant amounts of variance in the mediating variable. Second, the independent variable must likewise do the same for an outcome variable. It must be related to the outcome variable and account for significant amounts of its variance. Finally, when both the mediating variable and the independent variable are considered together, the relationship between the independent variable and the outcome variable fades and is no longer statistically significant. As a result, mediation is examined by looking at a pattern of results across three regressions. Let's go over those conditions again. First, we must determine whether there is a relationship between the mediator and the independent variable. And to do this, we would regress the mediator on the independent variable. Now, if mediation is present, we should find that the independent variable is related to and accounts for variance in the mediating variable. Next, we should look at the relationship between the dependent variable and the independent variable. Now, to do this, we should regress the dependent variable, or dv, on the independent variable, or the iv, and if the variables are related, then the independent variable must account for variance in the dependent variable. The final step is to regress the dependent variable on both the independent variable and the mediator. Now, this should make sense. If mediation is present, the mediator should account for variance in the dependent variable, even when the independent variable is included as a predictor. So this leads us to an important pattern of results that must be present. Namely, for mediation to be present, the relationship between the independent variable and the dependent variable must be less in the third regression equation than in the second regression equation. In other words, introducing the mediator had the effect of reducing the relationship between the independent variable and the dependent variable. Now, why is this? Because the mediator is now accounting for the variance in the dependent variable originally accounted for by the independent variable. Now, in the case of full mediation, the independent variable no longer has any effect on the dependent variable when the mediator is included in the regression equation. This doesn't happen very often, but it would suggest full mediation of the relationship between the predictor and outcome variables. Now, how to test for moderating effects of variables depends on the nature of the variables involved and whether they are categorical or continuous. In the simplest case, the moderating variable, we'll go back again. 1, 2, 3. Now, how to test for moderating effects of variables depends on the nature of the variables involved and whether they are categorical or continuous. In the simplest case, the moderating variable and the independent variable are categorical, and the dependent variable is continuous. The most efficient analysis in this case is a 2x2 analysis of variance, or two-factor ANOVA. For example, earlier we discussed how gender might moderate the relationship between time at a company and salary. The fact that more senior people make more money than new hires, regardless of gender, is a main effect for time at the company. Now, we might also find that men, on average, have higher annual salaries than women, regardless of the amount of time they've been with the company. That would be a main effect for gender. And the interaction effect is where the moderating effects of gender could come into play. Although time at a company is associated with higher salaries for both sexes, an interaction effect would occur if the most senior males had higher salaries on average than the most senior females. This would be the case even if there were no gender differences in salary for new hires. Here's a good example of using regression to identify an interaction effect. You would use this approach rather than the ANOVA if the independent variable and moderating variable were continuous rather than categorical. So let's revisit the trauma research done by Pinellas and colleagues. Recall in their study, PTSD symptom severity 3 months after victimization was the outcome variable. Initial trauma reactivity, which was heart rate escalation when recounting the event at 1 month, was the predictor. The moderating variable was an avoidant coping style. In the regression analysis, the interaction term for trauma reactivity and avoidant coping style was a significant predictor of some PTSD symptoms at 3 months. Specifically, the interaction term accounted for significant variation in total PTSD symptoms, re-experiencing symptoms, and numbing symptoms. Thus, an avoidant coping style moderated the relationship between initial trauma reactivity as measured by heart rate and certain PTSD symptoms at 3 months. Initial trauma reactivity combined with an avoidant coping style predicted increased trauma symptoms 3 months later. 1, 2, 3. We can also express this moderating relationship graphically. You might recognize the intersecting lines of the graph as indicative of an interaction effect. We would interpret this graph in the following way. At time 2, which was 3 months post-trauma, PTSD symptoms were the highest in individuals who showed the highest heart rate when recounting what happened to them, and were the most avoidant in dealing with their trauma. Okay, let's talk about power. What is power? Power refers to the likelihood of detecting a relationship between two variables when it actually exists in the population. That's the same as saying it is the likelihood of correctly rejecting a null hypothesis. High-power designs provide the necessary conditions to reject the null hypothesis when it should be rejected. In contrast, low-power designs often result in a failure to detect a relationship that should have been detected. The most frequent culprit for low power is a small sample size. Detecting statistically significant moderating effects requires a very large sample size, and because clinical samples are often difficult to collect, many samples are small, and these studies are unable to detect the effects of moderating variables. In many cases, moderators are discovered post hoc and must be tested in subsequent studies. This makes the process of identifying reliable moderating variables pretty lengthy and cumbersome. Identifying moderating and mediating variables is important for several reasons. First, if we don't understand which variables moderate or mediate relationships between other variables, we do not truly understand how a system functions. It is rarely the case that there is a one-to-one correspondence between a stimulus and a response. Second, there are also practical reasons why it is important to understand the role of moderating and mediating relationships. From a health policy and insurance standpoint, research like that done by Pinellas and colleagues has implications for thinking of psychotherapy as a legitimate and valuable mental health treatment for individuals. That same research project has another clear implication for clinical psychologists. Avoidance does not work, especially in individuals who show high initial physiological reactivity to trauma. Thus, the research provides justification for helping clients actively process and deal with a traumatic event rather than avoid it. Hey, you've learned a lot. Now it's time for the lightning round. Here are a few questions to reinforce your learning. Pause the video after each question is presented and then pick an answer. Resume the video to see if you answered correctly. Which of the following statements is true? A moderating variable accounts for the relationship between two other variables. B, a mediating variable modulates or regulates the relationship between two other variables. C, analysis of variance is the preferred procedure for testing a mediating relationship. Or D, a true mediator reduces or eliminates the relationship between a predictor and an outcome variable. Okay, think about this for a second and pause the video now. Okay, if you answered D, you got it right. A characteristic of a mediator is that it is both related to an independent variable and it weakens the independent variable's relationship with an outcome variable once the mediator is accounted for. Okay, here's another question. Which of the following would be an example of a moderating variable? A, the role of the amygdala in regulating a fear stimulus in a cat to an aversive stimulus. B, a strong positive relationship between the number of dogs in a city and the number of crimes. Human population density can account for the relationship. Or C, the level of self-esteem and the relationship between internalizing coping style and body dissatisfaction in middle school girls. Okay, think about that. Okay, so you've made your choice. Let's go back and take a look. This one probably took a little bit of thought. Answer A is not correct since the amygdala mediates a fear response. If we remove the amygdala, cats generally show no fear of stimuli, which they should fear. Thus, the amygdala mediates but does not moderate the fear response. Answer B is not correct because it is an example of a mediating relationship as well. Although there is a strong relationship between the number of dogs in a city and the number of crimes, that relationship depends entirely on the number of people living in the city. Once the number of people is taken into account, the relationship between the number of dogs and the number of crimes virtually disappears. So, answer C is correct. In an actual study done by Mitchell and colleagues in 2012, an internalizing coping style was found to be related to overall body dissatisfaction in middle school girls, but only in girls who had low self-esteem to begin with. The lower a girl's self-esteem, the stronger the relationship between internalizing coping style and body dissatisfaction. In other words, an interaction effect. Hey, great job. Understanding the difference between moderating and mediating variables can be difficult at times, but it's important to know the differences. As clinical researchers, a good part of what we do involves trying to understand the role of moderators and mediators. As an aspiring clinician, keep these principles in mind so that you can provide your future clients the highest possible quality of care and produce sophisticated clinical research.